Hi, my name is Anna and I would like to present you one of our research works, Trails, which is a mobility model which we believe is closing the gap between hybrid mobility models, hybrid stochastic mobility models, and trace-based mobility models for simulation. First of all, what are these mobility models? Mobility models are typically used in simulation in order to mimic the behavior or the movement of some entities like cars or people. If we take something really simple, let's say we have an area like this, and we would like to make a person or a car move around, one of the simplest possibilities is to use a random mobility model. There exist two very famous ones, which I would like to shortly present to you. One is a so-called random point, where we select a random point somewhere in the environment. We select a destination random point and we move on a straight line with some predefined speed to that point. Once we reach that one, we select a new one and we go to this one, and so on and so forth. The problem of this mobility model is that because the random points are inside of this environment, actually we never go to the borders of this environment. So the other possibility is to use random direction, where we again start in a random position, but instead of selecting a random next point, we select a random direction. So for example, I could decide to go in this way, and whenever I hit the border, then I select a random direction again, until I hit the limit again, and so on and so forth. In this way, I cover the complete field, which is a little bit better. The problem with random mobility models is, however, that they're too random. Nobody of us is actually moving randomly through the environment. We have our daily schedules, we move together, cars are moving on streets, and so on. So another possibility is actually, instead of using such stochastic models, random models, we could actually also trace whatever we can say. We have again our model here, but instead of mimicking where we could go, we actually get real measurements from real devices, let's say from our smartphones or from sensor nodes, which are logging our GPS positions over some time, and then we replay those traces in our simulation. So with other words, in this case, I will be following some really realistic trajectories, and I will stay at some point for a very long time, then I will move forward, I will stay here. And if you put them on top of each other for different people or for different vehicles, you would see that they're actually moving together, they're moving on streets, they have long pauses when we are in the office or at work or in the home, and so on. However, the problem with those trace-based mobility models is that they are very expensive. They're very expensive to gather all of these coordinates and data, and they're also quite limited in terms of how big my simulations can be. So, for example, one of the biggest traces which we have right now is the so-called San Francisco CAP traces, which are for 536 nodes. And they're taken over 3 weeks. However, those traces are not perfect. There are big gaps when the GPS was off or some nodes were off, so it is not ideal. And secondly, when we're replaying them in the simulation, we're really limited to this number of nodes, and we're limited also to the time which we have got for these traces. So in this case, for example, for San Francisco, the 3 weeks. There is also another class, a third class of mobility models called hybrid mobility models. Those are mathematical stochastic models which use, however, real traces in order to parameterize themselves. So, for example, one such model is SWiM, Small Worlds in Motion, which is using real mobility traces in order to parameterize things like how many points of interest are on the map, how far I'm going to stroll between my home location and other locations, how long do I pause in a particular location, and so on and so forth. The good thing about the hybrid mobility model is that they're very scalable, so I can use it to build simulations with hundreds and potentially thousands and many thousands of nodes. That's not a problem. but their realism is still limited, because from one point of interest to another point of interest, I'm still usually moving on a straight line. And these straight lines are really a problem for realism, because this is not mimicking our behavior in a realistic way. So what we're proposing here instead is the so-called trails model. The trails model, the basic idea of the trails model is that if you have a map like this one, where I have different traces from real data, so real GPS logs. So for example, here you see some blue dots and we see some red dots. And those dots are my individual GPS locations or logs. You see that I have several ones which I have gathered over many days or many different occasions. And this is actually where I live. So one of them is strolling, the red one, for example, is strolling from my home to the office where I live. Then the black one is taking exactly the same, let's say, for start and end position, so home and work, but is using a completely different route. So in the first case, I was actually taking the bike, and in the next one, I'm taking a tram. The difference is the route itself is a little bit different, and of course the speed already is different, and so on and so forth. What you see then is that what Trails does is actually first to extract the points of interest. The points of interest are those things here. And there are many algorithms in the state of the art in the literature how to extract points of interest from GPS locations. So I use those algorithms to extract all of the points of interest in my complete GPS log, which happen to be my home location, a couple of supermarkets which I'm visiting often, then the train stations. For example, this is a train station, and this is a train station, and this here, for example, is my office. This here is a hotel, and so on and so forth. So once I do that, I do the following trick. I take for each of those points of interest and calculate what is, first of all, their position. And I also calculate, or I store, what are their pause times. It is important to understand that I do not summarize those data, but I actually say in this point of interest I have spent once 10 minutes, once 8 minutes, once 32 minutes, and I store them as a list into that note. So what I'm trying to create is actually a graph where the nodes are my points of interest, those here. In each of them I store the pause times which I have really experienced in my log, and then I connect them with links or with edges in those graphs. However, that edge is not summarized or abstracted away to a straight line as other hybrid models do that, but I actually leave the GPS locations as they are. Which means that if I would like later in the simulation model to move from this location here to this one, I will not take a straight line with a constant speed from one location to the next, but I will follow exactly one of the available routes from one to another. It could be, and this is a very good idea, to have several possible routes. So for example, if I would like to move from my home location, this one, to my office location, this one, I will not take this route here, I will not take this, but I have two different options. Either I take the red route, which is following my biking route, or I will take the blue one, which is taking actually my tram route when it's raining, for example. So what I do next is that I have now this graph, which is stored as a file, where I store all of the nodes with their pause times and with their positions, and I store the individual edges between the individual nodes with full GPS locations. You might ask, of course, whether this is really a better idea than just putting all of the traces into the simulation. This is actually a good idea if you assume two things. First of all, you have to assume, and it's actually very true, is that when we're staying somewhere, we don't stay there for very little time, but most of the time we stay. So when I'm in my home, for example, I stay there for at least overnights and for big chunks of my other time. When I go to the office, I don't stay there only for 10 or 20 minutes, but I stay there for a really long time. So whenever I have recognized, I have identified a point of interest where I can stay in my simulation, it means also that I can compress this information to a single point, to a single GPS point, and I will instruct my simulation to stay there for some time. So I don't have to read all of these repeating GPS points, which I otherwise have implicitly if I'm staying in one location, but the log is saying it's actually almost the same point over and over again. So it is kind of a compression algorithm, so that the only GPS points which I still have is just one point of interest and all of the transitions, which is much more efficient than storing the complete trace. Another very interesting effect of this mobility model is that I can now introduce as many mobile entities as I actually wish to. If I would like, for example, to implement free entities moving on this simple, very small graph which I just presented, I can do so. I just initialize each of these entities to be in one of these points, and then they start moving around the trails graph as they wish. I can also implement on top of this graph some other more sophisticated ideas, for example, like a day-night rhythm where I stay during the night at home and during the day I go to the office. I can also implement things like going together with some friends or with some colleagues, and so on and so forth. So all of these sophisticated ideas, which exist also in other hybrid or stochastic mobility models and have been implemented by many other researchers, they can be taken also with this idea, but making the whole simulation much more realistic, because between the points of interest, between those positions, I don't move on a straight line, but I move on the real streets, on the real tracks which the GPS has recorded for me. I recorded this video in order to give you an idea of what Trails is. If you're interested in the implementation which we have for OMNet++, you can view our webpage and our GitHub repositories. And if you're interested in more scientific stuff, like how much Trails is really better or how much it's compressing the original trace, then you can look into our paper, which I referenced at the end of this video. Thank you very much.